Barbell back squats are absolutely killing your gains in the gym. All right, so maybe that's a little bit hyperbolic, but in my opinion, the barbell back squat is a highly overrated exercise, and today we're going to talk about why. Now, the squat specifically, really any form of the squat, is commonly regarded as a foundational exercise. Now, this really brings into question first what a foundational exercise is and whether or not an exercise can actually be foundational. So just to start off, and before we get to the squat specifically, I want to just eradicate this notion of the foundational exercise. This idea that the squat is foundational and it's good because it's foundational because it's good, it's just a circular line of thought that doesn't really actually mean anything. I personally think that people fall for this line of thinking and this general logic because it's just a lot easier to look at something and say that it looks good or that it looks bad, and it's a lot more difficult to actually be able to dive into the anatomy and the physics. Speaking of which, in order to understand the squat, we really need to break it down piece by piece to actually look at what are the component parts of the squat and where might it fall short in terms of, hypertrophy outcomes, strength outcomes, and just general function outcomes. Now, the barbell squat is traditionally thought of to be a closed chain exercise, which is not actually the case. The barbell squat is a closed chain exercise insofar as the foot, the ankle, and the knee are concerned, but in terms of the hips, the spine, and basically everything above the knee, it's an open chain exercise, meaning that your body can actually move in any which way under load. This becomes very clear when anyone lifts any relatively heavy amount of load for their relative amount of strength when their butt kicks back and they're trying to stay more vertical. And ironically, a lot of people use this closed chain argument to also sort of say something along the lines of the squat is more functional or foundational because your feet are on the floor. Well, any true closed chain exercise actually needs to be a machine-based exercise. So if you're someone who sort of falls into the functional crowd on these types of things, then you might want to sort of rethink that model. So when we start to look more specifically from a physics perspective at squat mechanics, how we can better conceptualize squat mechanics, we need to look at the conversation around segmental proportions. Segmental proportions is basically just a fancy phrase to say relative length of limbs. A lot of people falsely assume and claim that people with longer femurs generally have a tougher time staying more upright in a squat. And while visually speaking, long femurs actually do oftentimes result in a more hingy, deadlifty type squat, the long femurs in and of themselves are not the things that actually make it the case. A lot of people make this mistake of thinking that because someone has long femurs that they're not able to actually squat. In reality, it's the segmental proportion or the relationship of the femur to the length of the tibia and the length of the spine that plays the biggest role. This may seem like a trivial point that's not important to understand, but it's actually the most important thing when it comes to understanding squat mechanics. Femur length in and of itself is totally irrelevant. What is relevant is the length of the femur, again, relative to the other important segments and also relative to the individual's range of joint mobility. And just as an aside, whenever you say the word long or short, just understand that you're using what's called a relative term, meaning that it's only in relationship to other things that you're actually able to describe something. Eiffel Tower you could consider a tall building compared to most other buildings, but we know the implication of what we mean when we say the Eiffel Tower is tall. This is specifically because we're not looking at the squat mechanics of the Eiffel Tower. When we're looking at the squat mechanics of the human body, we need to actually look at the relative lengths, meaning the lengths of the femurs relative to the tibias and relative to the spine. So these are the characteristics that make someone look more naturally deadlifty or more naturally hingy when they're attempting to squat. Number one, longer femurs in relationship to the tibias and the trunk. Number two, extremely limited dorsiflexion relative to the normal standard. Number three, loads excessive relative to the strength and the ability of your quads to actually extend your knee. Now, all of these characteristics, if you just sort of flip them upside down, are the same things that actually make someone look more squatty or more vertical like a weightlifter when they squat. Number one is short femurs relative to longer tibias and a longer trunk. Number two is excessive amounts of ankle dorsiflexion, so just lots of range at the ankle. And when we say length of the tibia, keep in mind that we don't really mean the actual length of the bone, we just mean the effective distance between the knee and between the ground point contact underneath of the heel. This is why something like a heel elevation using some kind of wedge or some kind of plate to elevate the heels will improve someone's ability to actually squat more vertically in a more quad dominant squat, specifically because it's artificially increasing the length or the distance between where the knee is moving from and to and the actual point of contact underneath of the heel. Another reason that heel wedges provide such an awesome constraint for being able to squat more vertically is because they start the individual in a more plantar flexed or sort of ankle open position so that the individual can subsequently move into more dorsiflexion. In a sense, they can gain more range of motion at the ankle that way. So the heel wedges, in a sense, basically improve ankle range of motion, which is one of the characteristics that allows people to squat more vertically. And it also technically shortens the relative length of the femur because it increases the effective distance between the knee and the point of contact under the heel. All right, so where is all this going and what are all these little nuances actually leading to? The takeaway is basically that the squat is an exercise that forces the individual to work around the constraints of their own structure and their own range of motion. Most people, most of the time, are not going to be able to improve mobility to the degree that is necessary to actually change the squat exactly how you want it. You can do things like use heel elevations and change the degree of loading and change the position of the loading, but ultimately, to some degree, you're going to have to be constrained to the degree that your structure allows for and that your mobility allows for. In other words, the barbell squat specifically is an exercise where the individual has to work around the flaws of the exercise, and as a consequence, you may be forced to use tissues and muscles that are not the target muscles of the motion. And in addition, a lot of people end up just getting all sorts of weird pains because they're trying to work around and force themselves into an exercise that isn't well suited to their anatomy. I know some people personally who have worked on their mobility for years and years and years to no avail, and even with the highest amount of heel elevation, they're not able to actually create a squat like they could in a machine or a leg press that effectively stimulates their quads to the degree that's necessary to grow and progress. And this is the beauty of machines and other kinds of implements that are much less restrictive than free weight squats. Even if you took almost the exact same motion and put a bar on your back, instead of fixing both of your feet to the ground, you just did something like a lunge, there would be a lot more freedom to actually move and articulate yourself around a single leg as compared to having two legs glued to the floor. And this is why machines are so fantastic, because even though a lot of machines like leg presses are sort of fixed in their nature, what you do have access to and the ability to do is actually adjust things like seat heights and seat positions and hip widths, toe positions, and all those different things. You can make machines a lot more individualized than you can a free weight squat. So again, being constrained to this great degree to actually, fit your relative proportions, your range of motion, your structure, your anatomy to a specific exercise is limiting in a way that can not only prevent the specific kind of stimulus that you're looking to achieve, but also can potentially create loads of discomfort and loads of pain outcomes as you're doing it. Now, I'm not here to fearmonger and say barbell squats are the worst thing ever and deadlifts are the worst thing ever. I just think that a lot of people have this really negative experience with these motions, and they force themselves and they pigeonhole themselves into doing these exercises because their thinking is stuck in this traditional mindset which says that they have to squat and they have to deadlift and they have to do these specific motions. So it upsets me often when I see people that are really highly emotionally conditioned to think that they have to do certain things when there's basically no practical workaround for being able to actually justify those exercise selections. The only exercise that is really foundational and necessary for you to do when you go to the gym is to walk into the gym. That's literally the only thing that is a must-do exercise, is walking into the gym. Everything else should be individualized to your goals, your mobility, your structural constraints, your anatomy, your relative proportions, your segmental proportions, all those different things. You should individualize the exercise to you, and you should stop trying to individualize yourself to the exercise. If you want to learn more about this specific topic, definitely click the article link in the description below, or check out other courses from me where I teach anatomy and biomechanics, and specifically how you can work around the structural constraints of a squat.